My name's Mark. I was 36 when this happened. It was the fall of 2017. I just left my job at a logistics company in Wisconsin after nearly 10 years. I didn't quit because of anything dramatic, just burnt out, sick of office lights and back pain from bad chairs. I needed to reset. I had some money saved up, so I figured I'd take some time off and go up north. Real north, up near the Chequamegon National Forest. Just me and my dog, Jasper. Jasper was a 6-year-old golden retriever. Never aggressive, always happy, always at my heels. He liked swimming and chasing squirrels and hated plastic bags for some reason. He was more than a pet. He'd been with me through a breakup, the loss of my mom, and those long nights where I didn't want to speak to anyone. I trusted him more than I trusted most people. The plan was simple. I'd stay in a small off-grid cabin a few miles from the nearest paved road. No cell signal, no internet, solar power, and a little wood stove. I'd found it online. Someone rented it out to people who needed to unplug. It was built in the early 80s, tucked near a shallow creek and surrounded by thick pine forest. I brought canned food, freeze-dried stuff, a water filter, and a rifle just in case of bears. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. I'd hunted and camped before. I knew how to manage alone. At least I thought I did. We got there on a Wednesday. It was cold but dry. The leaves were already orange and brittle on the ground. The air had that crisp edge you only get in the North Woods in October. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just one room with a cot, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area with a gas cooktop, and a little table by the window. There was a small outhouse behind the cabin. I liked it right away. It smelled like pine and smoke, and the porch creaked just enough to feel old but solid. Jasper seemed happy. He ran in circles around the place for a while, chasing nothing. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked, read, made small fires, and listened to the wind. At night, I wrote in a notebook or just sat and watched the darkness. The only sounds were owls and the occasional cracking branch. Jasper slept on the cot with me or on the floor by the stove. He didn't bark once. By the 4th day, I started noticing things. Little things. It began with a trail I didn't make. There was a slope behind the cabin that led to the creek. It was mostly covered in pine needles and loose soil. That Saturday morning, I saw a fresh path cut through it. Not deep, more like someone had walked there a few times. I didn't think much of it. Could have been deer. But Jasper stared down that trail a long time, tail stiff, ears up. He didn't growl, but he didn't move either. I called him back and we went on with our day. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I got up twice to look out the window. Nothing moved. The forest was still. Too still. I'd grown up near woods. This felt off. Usually you hear things at night. Owls, mice, wind. But that night, there was nothing but a low hum in my ears and the sound of my own breath. I stayed awake until 3 in the morning. Jasper didn't move from the door. He didn't sleep either. The next day, I went down the slope to check that trail. It wasn't an animal. I saw faint boot prints. Not mine. Too narrow, too light. They led from the bottom of the slope and stopped maybe 30 feet from the cabin. No prints going back. I followed them a little, then lost them near the creek. The ground was harder there, and the leaves covered everything. I didn't panic. I figured maybe it was an old trail someone else had used before me, a hunter or another renter. Still, I kept the rifle loaded that night and leaned it against the table. I set up a small bell from my pack on the porch, something I usually used on hikes to alert bears. Just a little line of fishing wire tied to the steps. If anyone walked up, it would jingle. Nothing happened that night, but Jasper barely slept. He paced back and forth for hours, sniffing the corners of the room and stopping to stare at the front door. Around 4 a.m., he finally curled up at my feet. Monday was cloudy and cold. I decided to hike east, deeper into the woods. I wanted to clear my head. I brought Jasper the rifle, a compass, and a water bottle. We didn't go far, maybe 3 miles out and back. But when we returned, something had changed. The bell was gone. The fishing wire was still there, but the bell was missing. I checked the steps, the porch, the ground around it. Nothing. Jasper sniffed the railing hard, then growled for the first time since we'd gotten there. I looked up and scanned the woods, but there was nothing but trees. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the cot with the rifle across my lap, listening. Around 2, Jasper sat up straight, stared at the window for a full minute, then let out one sharp bark. Not loud, but direct. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. Nothing. I turned off the lantern and let the cabin go dark so I could see out better. Then I saw it. Down by the creek, maybe 50 feet out. A man, just standing there. He wasn't moving, not walking, just standing half behind a tree. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him. Medium build, wearing a jacket. That was it. I stared for what felt like 10 minutes. He didn't move, neither did I. Eventually I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for the sun. The next morning I packed my stuff. I was done. I didn't want to spend another night out there. I had 3 more days booked, but I didn't care. I started packing up my gear and food. But when I stepped outside to get the rest from the shed, something was off. There were boot prints, clear this time, in the dirt near the woodpile. They circled the cabin. They weren't mine. The tread was different, narrower. They came from the woods, walked all the way around the cabin, then disappeared back toward the slope. I loaded everything in the truck and got Jasper in the passenger seat. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Battery was dead. I checked the cables, both were connected, no corrosion. I tried again. Nothing. I don't know why, but I opened the hood. There was a clean cut in the positive cable. Someone had sliced it. Not ripped, not chewed. Cut. Jasper growled again, low and steady. I backed into the cabin, rifle up, and locked the door. That day moved like syrup. I kept the door locked and stayed inside, sitting near the window. Every sound made me jump. Jasper stayed at the door the whole time. I couldn't call for help. No service. I didn't have a satellite phone. I hadn't thought I'd need one. That was my mistake. Around 5 p.m., I saw him again. This time he was closer, 20 feet from the tree-line. Still not moving, just watching. I kept the rifle on him but didn't shoot. I didn't want to risk hitting a tree and wasting a bullet. I had only 10 rounds, but I stared back, my hands shaking. I watched him for almost half an hour. He didn't move once. Then the sun went down. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, holding the rifle, waiting for a sound I didn't want to hear. Jasper stayed alert the whole time. Around midnight, I heard steps, real steps, on the porch. Then something brushed the side of the cabin. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door. I could hear breathing, not loud, but there. I waited. A minute passed, then another. I didn't move. My finger was on the trigger. Then I heard a creak. The side of the cabin again. Then silence. I sat there until dawn. When it got light, I went outside. The prints were everywhere, circling the cabin again. They stopped 5 feet from the window where I'd seen him the night before. The prints were fresh. I followed them a little down to the creek. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The bell. It was tied to a tree branch eye level, hanging by my own fishing wire. I turned and ran back to the cabin, grabbed my pack and the rifle, and started walking. I left everything else. I knew there was a service road 5 miles west. I didn't care if it took all day. I wasn't staying. Jasper stayed close to my side. Every now and then he'd look back. So would I. I reached the road by evening. A truck came by an hour later. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older guy hauling lumber, gave us a lift to a gas station with a payphone. I called my cousin to come get us. 2 days later, I went back with him and a sheriff's deputy to get my truck and report what happened. The cabin was untouched, nothing missing, but the prints were gone. Rain had come through, washed it all away. The deputy didn't say much, just nodded and took notes. He said there were occasional reports of squatters in the woods. Nothing they could do unless someone got hurt. We towed the truck out and left. I didn't look back. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I knew he watched us. For days, I knew he waited until I was asleep to come close. He'd cut the battery, stolen the bell, crept around the cabin while I sat inside thinking I was safe. He could have come in, but he didn't. I don't know why. That's the part that keeps me up sometimes. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a man, and that's what made it worse. I never went back to that forest. I still go camping, but never alone, never that far out. And every time I light a fire or hear a branch snap in the dark, I look at Jasper. If his ears go up, we leave. I learned something important out there. You don't need ghosts to feel real fear. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods is the person you didn't know was already watching. It was early October of 2017 when I took a break from everything. I was 38 years old then, working as a freelance surveyor for different property agencies around Lancashire. That kind of job had its ups and downs. Sometimes I could go days without a proper project, and sometimes I'd be up at 4 in the morning, driving to the middle of nowhere to photograph crumbling rooftops and draft reports for people I'd never meet. After a particularly stressful couple of months filled with tight deadlines and awkward site visits, I booked myself a week away in the hills of Northumberland. A mate of mine, Ben, who was also in the property game, had bought a bit of land up near Rothbury. It was all trees and heather, a few crumbling dry stone walls, and no other structures for about a mile in any direction. He'd recently built a simple off-grid wooden cabin on it, solar panels with stove, rainwater tank, that sort of thing. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal. He offered to let me stay there to get some peace. I didn't need to be convinced. I arrived late in the afternoon, around 4:30, after weaving my car along the narrow country lanes. The weather was calm, slightly overcast, and cool in that typical northern autumn way. I'd parked where the dirt track ended, just before it turned to grass and stones, and walked the remaining couple hundred meters to the cabin with my backpack and a plastic crate of food supplies. The cabin was simple but well built. Wooden walls stained dark from weather sealant, a pitched roof covered in metal sheeting, and a narrow deck that wrapped around one side. Inside, it had a small kitchenette, a cot with heavy blankets, a desk, and a cast iron stove, a single window on each wall, and a skylight above the bed. The toilet was a composting one, tucked in a wooden outhouse about 20 paces behind the cabin, through a break in the trees. That first evening was quiet. I made a cup of tea on the little gas burner and sat out on the deck in my thick jacket, watching the wind push the clouds across the pale sky. A few birds, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, and nothing else. I didn't spot a single person the entire time I was walking in. The land around the cabin sloped gently, rising towards a line of thicker trees about a mile up, and falling off into dense bracken and scattered heather patches downhill. I felt still, finally. That kind of silence you forget exists when you live near towns and train lines and noisy neighbors. I went to bed early and slept a bit rough. Not because of any noises or anything. I just wasn't used to the stiffness of the cot or the pitch blackness. But I didn't mind. It was better than staring at my phone in some budget hotel. The next morning, I made porridge, read for a while, and hiked a bit. I didn't bring much, just one backpack and a few essentials. The hike took me uphill through the line of trees. Some of the forest had been left to grow wild, while other sections looked like they'd once been managed. Old forestry tracks partly reclaimed by moss and weeds. I spotted a few signs of old fencing, but nothing recent. It really did feel like no one had been out here for a while. I was heading back down around midday when I saw her for the first time. She was far off, at least 100 meters down a slope, half concealed by low brambles and shoulder-high heather. At first, I thought it was just a coat hanging off a fence post or something. She was crouched low, unmoving, and facing away from me. Her hair was long, very dark brown or black, and she was wearing what looked like a heavy, pale green coat. Something too big for her, baggy around the shoulders and sleeves. I couldn't see her clearly through the brush, and I didn't want to startle her, so I didn't shout. But something about how still she was made my stomach twist a little. She didn't move. Not when I stepped forward, not when I adjusted my footing to get a better view. I stood there for nearly a minute trying to make sense of her position. Was she picking something? Looking for something? Hiding? Eventually, I cleared my throat loud enough to carry. She didn't react. I waved my arm once, then again. Nothing. The wind rustled the heather around her, and that was it. I backed away and left her there. It wasn't my business. Maybe she was foraging. Maybe she was mentally unwell. Maybe she just wanted to be alone. Either way, I didn't want to go stumbling down the hill and scare some local woman by accident. Back at the cabin, I kept thinking about her. There were no marked trails out here. No signs of anyone camping or hiking. No recent tire tracks on the grass path. She didn't have a dog. No walking stick. No backpack. I made tea and read for a while to settle my nerves. Later that evening, around 6, I walked around the cabin perimeter and spotted boot prints in the muddy bit beside the outhouse. I couldn't say if they were mine from earlier, but something about them didn't line up. The treads were too wide apart, like whoever walked left and then came back wasn't walking in a straight line. I didn't feel like cooking anymore, so I just ate a couple of oat bars and turned in early again. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the toilet. The cabin was pitch black, but I kept a torch by the bed. I sat there for a minute, debating whether to go outside or wait until morning. Eventually, I threw on my jacket and stepped outside. The air was cold, wet-smelling, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the wooden steps and then on the gravel path toward the outhouse. That's when I saw it. The light from my torch swept across the path, and something pale darted behind the outhouse wall. I froze, light trembling in my hand. I stayed perfectly still and listened. Nothing, not even the crunch of a footstep. I waited 30 seconds, then slowly walked toward the side of the outhouse and swung the beam around the corner. No one there. I looked behind the trees. I checked the outhouse. I even walked around the cabin once before going back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come again that night. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a fox or badger. Maybe my imagination. The light plays tricks when you're half asleep. I still didn't feel right, though. I left a note on the table, just a scribbled message saying where I'd gone, and I hiked into the nearest village about 5 miles down. Took me almost 2 hours. There was a small shop and a pub. I had breakfast and used the landline to call Ben. Told him everything felt off at the cabin. Asked if he'd had anyone else out there. He said no. Said last time he was up there was a month ago. He didn't know of anyone who went near the property. I didn't mention the woman. Felt strange to talk about her out loud. On the walk back, the weather turned. Cold rain, low clouds, and that creeping mist that makes everything feel quiet and strange. I hiked quicker than before. Took a shortcut through a patch of low trees and disturbed a bird's nest, which scared me half to death. I got back to the cabin soaked, but it was still locked, nothing disturbed. Everything inside was exactly as I left it. That night, I made a fire, kept the lights low, and stayed inside. I placed my torch, a pocket knife, and a small camping hatchet on the desk, just in case. I didn't plan to sleep. I just wanted the night to pass. Around midnight, I heard soft crunching footsteps outside. I killed the lantern. The steps circled the cabin slowly. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. My breathing was loud in my ears. The steps stopped outside the front door. Then nothing. I waited. I didn't move. Then soft footsteps again, moving off around the back. I stood by the window for over an hour, watching the blackness outside, my ears straining. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I found more boot prints. They circled the cabin like I'd heard. The mud was pressed deep where they'd stopped. I packed my things and left by noon. I didn't lock the cabin behind me. I just wanted to get out. On the way down, I passed the same patch of heather where I'd seen the woman crouching before. She wasn't there, but someone had been. The heather was flattened in a strange oval shape, like someone had laid there for hours. I walked around it slowly and saw something small in the grass. Piece of string, pale green, frayed, and slightly damp. I kept walking. Back at my car, I found a smear on the driver's side window, a handprint. It was too small to be mine. The fingers were long and thin, and it was fresh. I drove straight to Ben's place and gave him the keys. Told him I didn't want to stay again. Didn't explain why. For months after that, I had dreams about the cabin. In every dream, I'd see her, crouched in the heather, staring at something I couldn't see, or standing by the outhouse, watching the door. Always just watching, never moving much, never speaking. I still don't know who she was. Maybe a squatter, maybe someone with mental illness, maybe someone hiding. I've worked on hundreds of properties since then. Abandoned farmhouses, overgrown estates, rotting coastal shacks, but I've never felt fear like I did in that cabin, and I've never gone back. Ben sold the land a year later. He never got a good price for it. The buyers didn't stay long. He told me they moved out after only 2 weeks. Said they didn't give a reason, just packed up and left. I never asked. I didn't want to know. It had been 6 months since David passed away. We hadn't spoken much in the last few years, not after the divorce, but I still felt something twist in my stomach when I got the call. His brother said it was sudden, a stroke, 48 years old. He died alone in that old wooden cabin up in northern Idaho where we used to spend weekends when we were still trying to make things work. I didn't cry at first, not when I heard the news, not even when I saw the photo of him they used in the obituary. It didn't hit me until I started thinking about that place, the cabin, something about the silence in the woods, the way the floorboards creaked no matter how careful you stepped, the tin roof that never quite kept out the rain. I remembered packing up the last of my stuff from there in 2017, the quiet that settled between us as I shut the car door and drove away. Neither of us knew it would be the last time. In April of this year, his brother reached out again, said they needed someone to go up and clear out the place. David had no kids, no will, and the cabin was just sitting there untouched. I wasn't on the deed anymore, but apparently I was the only one who knew where things were, where he kept papers, tools, valuables. His brother lived down in Texas and couldn't fly up until summer. So, like an idiot, I agreed. It wasn't like I had a full-time job anymore. My freelance writing gigs barely paid the bills, and I figured maybe some closure would help. That's how I sold it to myself anyway. I packed up my Subaru, filled the tank, grabbed some supplies, and made the 8-hour drive from Eugene, Oregon to Clearwater County, Idaho. I brought my dad's old shotgun just in case. Bears were still a thing up there, but I didn't expect to need it. The road to the cabin hadn't changed much. Still gravel and rough in parts. Still that same long stretch of trees on either side. It was late afternoon when I got there. The sun was dipping low and cast long shadows across the trees. I parked in the dirt patch out front. The air was colder than I remembered. The pine trees smelled stronger than usual. I stood there a minute just looking at the place. The cabin sat 100 feet from the road, half hidden by brush. The porch was sagging a little more than I remembered. Paint peeled from the walls like dried skin. The windows were cloudy with dust, and the front door looked like it hadn't been touched in months. I could feel that hesitation already clawing at my back. The part of you that says turn around. But I didn't. I unlocked the front door with the old spare key David had left in a fake rock by the steps. The door opened stiff like it was stuck in the frame. I stepped inside and it was exactly how I remembered it, and also worse. The air smelled stale and a little sour. Dust hung in thick strips through the shafts of sunlight. The fireplace was cold, and there was a layer of ash still in the pit from whenever David last used it. A worn couch, a lopsided table, a few empty beer bottles on the floor. There were no signs of struggle. It looked like someone just stopped living. I spent the first hour just walking around, opening drawers, making mental notes of what I'd need to box up. His boots still sat by the door. His coat still hung on the back of the chair. It was eerie in a way that didn't need ghosts to feel wrong. The silence was loud, the kind that fills your ears and makes you realize how far you are from other people. I lit the fireplace with what was left of the firewood, heated up a can of soup on the old propane stove, and tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just the past sneaking up on me, memories pushing through the cracks. I hadn't seen David in years. I didn't know what he was like before he died. Maybe he lived in silence and didn't mind. Maybe he drank too much. Maybe he didn't care anymore. I slept that first night on the couch, wrapped in 2 old quilts, the shotgun propped next to me just in case. The wind howled off and on all night, rattling the windows. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I started sorting. Boxes in the corner, paperwork in piles, tools in the shed. The routine helped. I found old letters, utility bills, bank statements, and a half-written notebook where he'd started jotting down things about fishing and weather and random thoughts. It wasn't profound. It wasn't sad. Just ordinary. By the 3rd day, I started getting this weird feeling. It wasn't anything dramatic, just little things. I'd set down a screwdriver and come back to find it moved. I'd close the door to the shed and later it'd be slightly open. I kept telling myself it was my own fault. I was tired, distracted. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods anymore. I wasn't thinking clearly, but it kept happening. On the 4th night, I went to lock the shed and found the door already open. Not wide, just a crack. I stepped inside and found the tool chest had been opened. I didn't remember doing that. I hadn't even touched that drawer yet. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell. I chalked it up to my nerves, shut the thing, locked it again, and went inside. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, a soft crunch like a boot on gravel. Then nothing. I got up, heart thumping. I grabbed the shotgun, crept to the window, and peered out into the dark. I couldn't see anything but trees and the faint moonlight on the dirt path. I stood there for 20 minutes waiting for another sound, but it never came. Eventually, I sat back down on the couch and waited for the sun. The next day, I went into the woods. I don't know why I did it. Maybe part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. I followed the old game trail behind the cabin for about a mile. It was quiet, just birds and wind. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a campsite, a small one, barely noticeable. A flattened patch of earth, old cigarette butts, and a torn tarp tied between 2 trees. Someone had been living out here. Not long ago either. The ashes in the fire ring were still dark. I didn't see any bags or clothes, but I found an empty can of beans and a folding knife rusting in the dirt. I backed away slowly and didn't stop looking over my shoulder until I got back to the cabin. That afternoon, I packed faster. I taped up every box I could and loaded them into the Subaru. I kept the shotgun close and triple-checked the locks. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to drive the mountain roads at night, not tired. That was a mistake. That night I heard it again. Not just one footstep, several. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I shut off all the lights. I sat on the floor with my back to the couch, gun across my lap, breathing so quietly it hurt. The sound circled the building once. Then again, I heard a creak on the porch. Then silence. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I stepped outside with the gun raised. I walked the whole perimeter. I didn't see anyone, but I did find boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. Too large, too fresh. I loaded the last of the boxes and didn't even bother cleaning up. I locked the door, tossed the key back under the fake rock, and drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. It's been 2 months since that trip. David's brother finally flew up and said he'd sell the place. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but sometimes I still think about that cabin. I think about whoever was out there in those woods, watching. I think about the way David had written strange little lines in that notebook near the end. Things like, "Don't go out after dark," and "The woods aren't empty." I thought he was just drunk or rambling. Now I'm not so sure. I haven't been back since. I don't plan to. Whatever peace I thought I'd find up there never showed up. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in people. And I know that someone was out there. Someone was living close enough to hear every step I took, every box I moved, every time I turned on the lights. I don't know if they were watching David too. I don't know if they saw him die, or if he died knowing someone was out there. But I know this, if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. And I think that person in the woods knew that too. It was late October 2014 when I finally broke ground on the land I bought just outside of Redfield, Arkansas. I was 32, single, and tired of working concrete jobs in the city. I'd been saving for this land for years. It wasn't much, just under 2 acres of mostly flat pine woods, with a bit of slope near the rear where the trees grew thickest and the ground softened after heavy rain. The idea wasn't to live off the grid forever. I wasn't one of those off-grid guys. I just wanted a quiet place where I could get away on weekends and maybe, eventually, rent it out to campers or hunters. The land came cheap because the access road leading into the property was barely maintained and overgrown. It sat at the very end of an old gravel logging path off Highway 46. I had to clear over 30 yards of brush just to pull my trailer onto it that first weekend. I parked my 2003 Silverado at the top of the little rise near the entrance and walked the rest of the way in. It was damp, the air sticky even in fall, and the dirt clung to my boots. I'd brought the basics: power tools, a small generator, lumber I'd picked up in Little Rock, water jugs, and a cot for sleeping. The plan was to spend Friday night through Sunday afternoon getting the foundation posts in and maybe frame a couple of walls, if the weather held. I didn't bring a tent. I figured I'd sleep in the truck or under the tarp if I had to. Started raining late Friday night. Not a hard rain, but a slow, steady one. The kind that feels like it soaks through your skin over time. I'd already unloaded most of the materials and set them on cinder blocks to keep them dry, but the ground was already soft, and I knew if it kept up all weekend, I'd have trouble digging the post holes. Still, I'd driven over 2 hours to get here. I wasn't about to turn around and leave because of a little rain. I slept in the bed of my truck, wrapped in my old canvas jacket and resting against the toolbox I kept chained to the frame. The first night wasn't too bad. Cold, yes. Uncomfortable, definitely. but I'd slept worse. Saturday morning, I got to work. The rain hadn't stopped, but it hadn't gotten worse either. I fired up the auger I'd rented from a guy in town and started drilling the holes for the four corners of the cabin. My plan was simple: a one-room box, 16 by 16, nothing fancy. Just enough space for a bunk, a stove, and a table. I'd add a porch later once I saw how solid the ground stayed after rain. The holes went in slower than I wanted. The auger kept catching on roots. Pine roots, thick ones that spiraled under the soil like veins. Twice I had to stop and dig by hand because the machine couldn't get through. My gloves got soaked and my hands went raw from twisting the handles over and over again. I didn't eat much, just some jerky and a warm Coke I'd forgotten to put on ice. Around noon, the rain picked up. Not a storm, just harder, more insistent. The kind that gets into everything. I set up a small tarp over the cleared section where I planned to work, tying the corners to a few saplings and the back of my truck. I was wet, cold, and irritable, but I told myself this was the worst it would get. By the time I got the corner posts in and stabilized with quick-set concrete, it was already getting dark. The sky stayed the same color all day, gray and featureless. It was one of those days where you lose track of time without the sun. I decided to stay the night again. I figured I'd at least try to get a couple of the wall panels up by noon Sunday before packing it in. I lit my small propane heater, crawled back into the truck bed, and tried to rest. I must have fallen asleep sometime around 9 p.m. because when I woke up, it was after midnight and I was freezing. I got out of the truck, stepped into the mud, and nearly slipped. The entire site had turned to sludge. The tarp had sagged under the weight of collected water. My boot prints from earlier were gone, just smooth dark pools where I'd been walking all day. I took a piss behind the truck and stood there for a few seconds, listening. Something about the woods felt off. It wasn't the sound exactly, more like the absence of it. Normally you hear things in woods at night, crickets, frogs, the wind rattling branches. But this was dead quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. I chalked it up to the rain. It was heavier now, not loud, but enough to drown out distant noise. I shook it off and went back to the truck. But when I reached the tailgate, I noticed something. There were fresh prints, not from me, smaller, narrower. They didn't look like shoe prints, bare feet, human. 2 of them, side by side, not moving, like whoever made them had just stood there. I scanned around with my flashlight. Nothing but trees and thick, wet leaves. I walked around the site, shining the light in every direction, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably old prints that got filled in with rain. I told myself maybe a deer stepped in just the right way to look like a foot, but I knew that wasn't it. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. I left the light on in the cab and kept the heater running until it died around 4 a.m. When the sun came up, I told myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Too much work, too little food, and too much cold. Still, I looked around again in daylight. The ground was even messier than before. Mud had covered most of the site, but I still saw one of the prints near the corner post. I didn't say it out loud, but I remember thinking, that was recent. The edges were still sharp. The rain hadn't even started to wash them away. I got back to work. It helped me forget. I framed one wall by mid-morning and started the second by early afternoon. The wind picked up around one, and I decided it was best to call it. The last thing I wanted was a falling branch while trying to hoist plywood panels. I packed the tools, locked the trailer, and backed the truck down the narrow slope, headed back toward the road. I didn't return the next weekend, or the one after. Something about that place started to eat at me. The silence, the prints, the way the woods seemed too thick. I told myself it was paranoia. Still, I waited until mid-November before going back. I didn't even bring the truck in that time. I parked up at the old gravel turn-in and walked the rest of the way. The air had cooled. Dry leaves crunched under my boots. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. The tarp was gone. So were the plywood panels I'd left stacked near the posts. A few of the boards had been broken, snapped clean down the middle like someone tried to carry them and failed. The concrete around one post had cracked. There were deep, narrow holes in the dirt. Not animal holes, dug holes. Fresh. Someone had been there. I checked the trailer. It had been pried open. The door hung slightly ajar, like it had been forced. Inside, most of the tools were still there, but my propane, nails, and a few other things were missing. I filed a police report that night. Sheriff's deputy said they'd take a look, but that there wasn't much they could do without cameras or a plate number. I asked about squatters, drug camps, hunters, anything. He said sometimes people pass through and take what they need. Sometimes they come back. He told me to put up signs and maybe leave a camera or two next time. I didn't go back until December. This time I brought a friend. His name was Ray. We worked together back in Little Rock, and he liked the idea of helping out with the cabin. We hauled in fresh supplies, patched the damage, and tried to rebuild what we could. The rain came again on Saturday night, just like before. Same cold, same slow drizzle. But this time I wasn't alone. We both woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound just outside the tarp. Not footsteps, something dragging, something heavy, wet ground shifting under weight. We got out fast. Ray grabbed a hatchet from the tool chest. I held a flashlight and scanned the clearing. There was nothing there. No prints, no damage, nothing. But something had passed through. You could see it in the way the pine needles had been disturbed. In the way the mud had compressed in wide, odd shapes, like elbows or knees. No real tracks, just pressure marks. Random, scattered. Ray didn't want to stay. He didn't say it, but I could see it in his eyes. We packed what we could and drove back before sunrise. That was the last time I stayed overnight. I came back one final time in early spring 2015. Alone. Everything I'd built was gone. The posts were torn out. The ground was dug up. My trailer was flipped over on its side and rusting from the inside out. A black tarp was tangled in the branches 50 feet up, like it had been thrown. I didn't bother with tools or lumber. I just walked around the clearing one last time. I kept thinking maybe I could salvage something, anything. Then I saw them again. Not prints. Not this time. I saw holes. Deep, narrow, deliberate holes dug in a perfect circle, almost like a perimeter. 12 of them, just wide enough for a foot, or a stake, or maybe someone's idea of a warning. Each hole was about a foot deep, and in the middle of each one was something buried. I only checked one, just one. It was a bone, a small one, maybe a finger or a rib. Human or animal, I didn't know. But it had been wrapped in cloth and placed inside the hole like a ritual. I filled the hole back in. I didn't check the others. I left that afternoon, sold the land a few months later for half what I paid. Never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe squatters. Maybe someone living in the woods. Maybe something worse, but still human. All I know is that rainy night I first broke ground on that cabin. Something saw me, and it didn't want me there. It was October of 2019 when I decided to spend a few days alone up in the woods in rural Vermont. I was 31 at the time, living in Boston, working remote for a small tech startup, and starting to feel like the walls of my apartment were closing in. I'd been dealing with a burnout I couldn't shake, and all I wanted was to get away from my screen, from people, from everything. I wasn't the camping type, not really, but I'd been watching videos on solo backpacking and figured I'd try something close to it. I didn't want to go full wilderness, so I settled on an old cabin I'd found on a local hiking forum. The guy who posted about it said it was abandoned back in the 80s, sitting up north near a forgotten trailhead not too far from Lake Elmore. It wasn't on any map, but the directions were clear enough. Take a fire road off Route 12 for about a mile, park near a bent tree with an orange mark on it, then hike east for 20 minutes. He even uploaded a few photos of the place: weathered wood, sagging roof, overgrown with moss but still standing. That was enough for me. I packed my stuff the night before: sleeping bag, food for 4 days, a folding knife, a hatchet, a flashlight, 2 headlamps, extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. I also had my old Nikon camera, more for fun than anything else. I left my apartment early the next morning and reached the area a little before noon. The drive was quiet, the leaves bright and orange, and the air had that early fall chill that made it perfect for hiking. I found the tree with the orange mark just like the post said. The trail wasn't even a real trail, just a thin break in the trees with patches of flattened grass and the occasional old boot print. I followed it carefully, stepping over branches and watching for any sign of wildlife. It took me about 30 minutes of slow walking before I spotted the edge of the cabin. It looked just like the photos. A single-room structure, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a collapsed porch on one side and broken shutters hanging loose on the windows. The door was still there, hanging on a single hinge, and I pushed it open with my boot and stepped inside. The inside smelled like dry wood and old leaves. The floor was soft in places, creaking under my weight, but still solid enough to sleep on. There was a small fireplace at the far end, a rusted pot still sitting on the stone hearth. Someone had left an old cot frame leaned against the wall, but the mattress was gone. I set my pack down and spent the next half hour sweeping out some leaves and dirt with a pine branch I'd cut from outside. Then I laid my sleeping pad in the far corner, away from the draft. It was peaceful. I had no signal, no sound of cars, no voices. Just whined through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig in the woods. I made a small fire in the fireplace with twigs and dry bark I'd gathered, ate a cold sandwich, and read a bit by headlamp. The first night passed without much incident. I heard something walking through the woods around 2 a.m., but I assumed it was a deer or maybe a coyote passing through. I stayed in my sleeping bag and drifted off again. The second day, I decided to explore around the cabin a bit. The trees were thick and close, and the trail I'd come in on was hard to make out even in daylight. I marked a few spots with strips of bright orange tape, just in case. I didn't want to get turned around in the woods. Behind the cabin, maybe 30 yards out, I found something strange. A square patch of dirt that was flat and clear of leaves, as if someone had recently swept them away. The edges of the patch were sharp and clean, too clean to be natural. It was about 4 feet by 4 feet. At first, I figured it might have been an old garden bed or something, but there were no signs of plants, no fencing, nothing, just smooth dirt. I crouched down and pressed my palm against it. The earth felt loose. I should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the cabin, grabbed my small folding shovel, and returned to the square. I started digging. The top layer came off easily, loamy, soft, with small roots and worms squirming through it. About a foot down, the shovel hit something hard. I cleared the dirt slowly. First, I thought it was a wooden board. Then I realized it was more than one. Planks nailed together, old, splintered, and stained a strange gray-brown. I scraped away more dirt and saw the edges were too neat to be random. It was a box, a wooden box, buried in the woods behind an abandoned cabin. I stopped digging. Something about the way the earth smelled, wet and sour, started making me uneasy. My heartbeat picked up. I looked around. The woods were quiet, still, but I had that weird feeling that I was being watched, like something just out of sight was waiting to see what I'd do next. I went back to the cabin, sat on my sleeping pad, and stared at the fire pit for a while. My fingers were dirty, my boots caked with mud. I told myself I'd come back to it the next day. Maybe it was nothing. just old junk. But of course, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast of granola and coffee, I went back out with a stronger resolve. I cleared more dirt from around the box until I could see the whole lid. It had metal handles on either side, rusted but intact. No lock, no writing. I slipped my fingers under the edge and pulled. The lid creaked open. Inside was a canvas duffel bag. It was dark green, heavy-looking, and stained. I lifted it out and set it on the ground. It made a dull thump as it landed. My hands were shaking a little, but I pulled the zipper. The first thing I saw was plastic. Vacuum-sealed packets of what looked like dried meat or jerky. Dozens of them packed in tight. Underneath that, a small metal box. I opened it. Inside were 2 pistols, old models, probably from the 70s or 80s, wrapped in oily cloth. Below those, more packets, this time paper-wrapped bundles of what I guessed were cash. Pulled one out. Hundreds. Old bills. Worn and creased, but real. That's when the realization hit me. This wasn't just some survival stash. This was a drop. Someone had hidden all this here for a reason. Weapons. Money. Food. It wasn't the kind of thing you stumble onto by accident. And now I was holding it. I zipped the bag shut and looked around again. The woods still looked quiet, but my ears were buzzing. I felt exposed, like the trees were eyes. I carried the bag back to the cabin and put it in the far corner behind my pack. Then I sat by the fireplace for what must have been an hour, not sure what to do. By late afternoon, I made my decision. I'd leave the next morning. I'd take the bag with me and turn it in. Maybe to the police, maybe to the local Forest Service. I didn't want any part of whatever this was. I just wanted to leave. But that night was different. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. Not animal movement. Slow, steady footsteps crunching leaves. Then silence. Then more steps circling. I turned off my headlamp and stayed completely still. I heard breathing, right outside the wall. Faint inhale, exhale. Then a long pause. The footsteps moved toward the front. The broken porch creaked once. I held my breath. Nothing for several minutes. Then a scraping sound. Not loud, not sharp, like someone dragging something through the dirt. A minute later, it was quiet again. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sky started to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could. I left the bag behind. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't even want to touch it. I just wanted to get out. I followed my markers back through the woods, down to the fire road, and reached my car just after 8 a.m. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. I drove straight to a diner in Montpelier and sat for 2 hours, just drinking coffee and trying to calm myself down. I didn't call anyone. I didn't file a report. I didn't even go back to my apartment right away. I drove all the way to my brother's place in New Hampshire and crashed on his couch for a few nights. I didn't tell him anything. A few weeks later, I went back online and looked up that old hiking forum. The post about the cabin was gone. The user account that made it had been deleted. I never went back. I don't know who buried that bag. I don't know what it was meant for or who it was meant for. But the footsteps I heard that night weren't mine. Someone knew I'd found it. Maybe they were just watching. Maybe they were waiting. Either way, I got lucky. Sometimes people think abandoned places are just forgotten. But that cabin wasn't forgotten. Someone left something there for a reason, and I shouldn't have touched it. I still think about that square patch of dirt, about what else might be buried nearby. And I still keep a light on when I sleep, just in case. Back in 2016, I was 36 years old, living in southern Idaho, working in a welding shop 6 days a week. I didn't have much time for myself, but every fall, I made sure to take one full week off to hunt mule deer up near the Sawtooth Range. My uncle owned an old hunting cabin about an hour out from Stanley, tucked up near the edge of a forgotten fire trail. He hadn't used it in years and gave me permission to use it whenever I wanted. I had been there a few times before with my dad when I was younger, and I remembered it being quiet, rugged, and far from anything. I wanted to be alone. I wanted the cold air, the pine trees, the sound of my boots crunching frost. I didn't care if I got a deer. I just wanted out. That year, I decided to go alone. No friends. No dogs. Just me, my gear, and a borrowed .270 Winchester. I loaded up my beat-up old Tacoma with everything I needed: gasoline, propane, a generator, food, ammo, sleeping bag, boots, binoculars. I even brought an old Coleman stove and 2 full coolers. I overpacked, but I always do. I left early on a Sunday morning before the sun was up and drove the 5 hours straight through without stopping. The last 15 miles was rough. Dirt road turned to gravel, and gravel turned into 2 deep ruts through the forest. I had to drive slow, weaving around rocks and washed out dips. That path had grown narrower since I last visited. Pine needles covered the trail like a rug, and there were several points where low branches dragged across my windshield. By the time I reached the clearing, I was already tense. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. Slumped a little to one side, one shutter hanging by a hinge, moss covering the edges of the roof. The chimney pipe was rusted orange, but it still stood. I parked, stretched my legs, then walked a loop around the property. No tracks, no signs of anyone having been there. The ground was hard from an early frost. The only prints I saw were animal, rabbit, some kind of cat, maybe a fox. The air smelled clean, cold and sharp. I pulled out my gear, unlocked the heavy chain on the front door, and stepped inside. The interior was dusty, the air stale. I opened both front windows to let it breathe. There were 2 wooden bunks built into the back wall, a table, a couple of chairs, and a small stone fireplace in the corner. Mice had gotten into the place. Droppings along the floor, a chewed-up corner of an old wool blanket, but nothing worse. I swept it out, laid down a new sleeping pad, and set up the stove on the counter. I didn't start a fire. I wanted to stay outside a while longer. That first evening, I walked half a mile out and scouted an old clearing I remembered. Sure enough, there were fresh deer signs. Scat, prints, some stripped bark. I marked a spot I liked, made a mental note of the wind direction, then hiked back before it got too dark. I made chili from a can, sipped some whiskey, and sat by the fire with my boots off. The silence felt good. The first few days were normal. I'd wake up before dawn, make instant coffee, pack light, and hike out to my spot. I saw a few does and a small buck on the second day, but nothing worth pulling the trigger on. I didn't mind. The cold mornings, the stillness of the trees, even the soreness in my back. It all felt like a reset. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel wrong. I woke up at maybe 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. to the sound of crunching outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was a deer nosing around. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart already pounding, and listened. The steps were slow, heavy, not animal-like. I know what a deer sounds like. I've heard bears, too. This was different. It sounded like a person. Boots in the frost, moving in a slow circle around the outside of the cabin. I didn't move. I just sat up in the dark, holding my breath. There were no lights, no vehicle, nothing but that slow, dragging sound of someone walking. Then silence. It lasted about 10 minutes. Then I heard the footsteps again, quieter this time, moving back toward the tree lean behind the cabin. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning, gun across my lap. When it got light, I went out and walked the perimeter. I expected to see boot prints, but there was nothing clear. The frost had hardened again. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Maybe it was an animal walking strange. Maybe a moose or an elk. But deep down, I knew better. I know what footsteps sound like, and those were footsteps. I didn't hunt that morning. I spent most of the day double-checking my gear, making sure my truck still started, looking around the woods near the cabin for any signs of someone. I found nothing. No trash, no tracks, no broken branches. Just more woods. I started feeling a little stupid. That night, I kept my lamp on and only dozed lightly. Nothing happened. Same for the night after. I started thinking maybe it was all in my head. I hunted both days but didn't see anything worth shooting. On Friday, I packed up most of my stuff, cleaned the cabin, and planned to leave early Saturday. Friday night is when things went bad. I had just laid down, the fire was burning low, and I heard the sound again, this time clearer. Heavy steps, slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the window near the table. I didn't move. My rifle was already on the floor next to me. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The faint scrape of fingernails or something metal across the wood siding. Not fast, slow. A dragging scratch like someone testing the wall. I sat up fast and turned on the lantern. The sound stopped instantly. I stood there frozen, staring at the window. I couldn't see out into the dark, but whoever or whatever was out there could probably see me clearly. Then came a knock. One single knock on the window pane. Slow and heavy. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going, sat with the rifle pointed at the door, and waited for daylight. As soon as the sky started to go gray, I threw my gear into the truck, didn't even bother locking the cabin, and started driving out. The road felt narrower, darker. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. But nothing came. 10 miles out, just before I hit the gravel road, I saw something that still gives me chills. A fresh boot print in the mud, right in the center of the path. Not mine, not from the way in. A single, clean print, facing the direction I had come from. I didn't stop. I drove straight home. When I got back to Boise, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said I got skunked and came back early. I had nightmares for weeks, dreams of footsteps circling, of slow knocking, of being watched from the woods. A month later, I got curious and checked satellite imagery online. That cabin? It doesn't show up on the newer maps. The road is overgrown.
No listing. No markings.
It's like it was never there. I haven't been back. I never told my uncle either. I don't think he remembers that place well enough to ask about it. Sometimes, though, when I go out to check the mail or walk my dog late at night, I still get that feeling. Like someone's watching from the trees. Like they followed me back. And the worst part? I still don't know what would have happened if I had answered that knock. I was 36 when I stayed in that cabin beside the old graveyard, and I still think about it every week, even now. This happened in the fall of 2017, in a quiet, mostly forgotten part of southern Arkansas. My name's Jeremy Kessler, and back then, I was in between jobs after a long run as a land surveyor. I wasn't married, didn't have any kids, and for the first time in a long while, I had time to myself. That's what I thought I needed. I'd inherited a small, beat-up truck from my uncle after he passed, and I decided to use it to get away for a while. Just me and the road. I didn't want anything fancy. No hotels, no tourist spots. I wanted somewhere quiet and out of the way, where I could think for a bit and try to get my head right. I found that place just outside a town called Bronson, population probably no more than 400. They had a diner, a gas station, and a few buildings that looked like they hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. About 4 miles outside Bronson, there was a listing on a travel site for a solitary rustic cabin for rent on private land. The pictures were simple. Old wooden walls, a small bed, a stove, and a view of a sloped hill covered in trees. No mention of a graveyard. The rate was cheap, $90 for 3 nights, no deposit. I booked it that same night. I figured I'd drive out, stay there a while, write in my notebook, hike a little, and get my thoughts straight. The kind of stuff people say they'll do when they need to fix their life. I pulled in late afternoon, just before sundown on a Friday. The road turned to gravel about a mile out, and by the time I reached the cabin, my tires had kicked up half the dust in the county. The place looked even more worn than in the photos. The porch was sagging a bit on one side, and the roof looked like it hadn't been inspected in decades. Still, it was quiet. The trees surrounding the place were tall and packed tight. It was early October, and some of the leaves had already started turning red and gold. I parked in the dirt, unloaded my duffel, and made my way inside. It was musty, smelled like old wood and something a little metallic, like rust or stale water. There was a mattress that had clearly seen better days, a potbelly stove with a stack of dry wood next to it, and one small window facing out back. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no TV. Just a battery-powered lamp on the table and a bucket toilet out back. I liked it. It was simple. The weird thing was the backyard. From the front, the cabin just looked like it was surrounded by woods. But out back, about 60 yards down a slope, there was an old graveyard. I hadn't seen it in the listing. It looked ancient, the kind of place you only find in forgotten woods, where the names are worn off the stones and everything's sinking back into the dirt. Most of the headstones were crooked, cracked, or leaning. A few iron fences still surrounded some of the plots, but they were bent and rusted. I counted at least 24 graves, probably more. It should have creeped me out more than it did, but I was tired from driving and figured I could deal with it. It wasn't like anyone was going to climb out of those graves. They'd probably been dead for 100 years or more. That first night, I made a small fire in the stove, cracked open a can of beans, and tried to relax. The silence out there was unreal. No cars, no people, just the wind and the occasional creak of old wood. Around midnight, I killed the lamp and crawled into the bed, which groaned under my weight. I laid there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. There was something strange about the silence. It was too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound I heard was a slow ticking noise, like wood shifting or maybe something dripping. I told myself it was normal. Old cabins make noise. The second day, I walked down to the graveyard. The sun was out, and I figured it wouldn't seem as spooky in the daylight. I brought my notebook and sat on a rock near the tree line, just watching the old stones. Some had dates, 1880s, 1890s, but most of them were too worn to read. I noticed a few smaller stones, ones that probably marked children. One grave had a small, rusted metal cross lying flat next to it. No name on it. It gave me a chill. I didn't stay down there long. The rest of the day, I hiked through the woods, took some notes, ate crackers, and canned chili. But something had changed. I kept feeling like I was being watched, like there were eyes in the trees. I didn't see anything, no animals, no other people, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When I walked, I kept looking back. When I stood still, I thought I heard rustling. The woods were dense, but I kept telling myself it was just squirrels or wind through the branches. I went back inside around sunset and locked the door, even though there was no one for miles. I had trouble sleeping that night. I kept waking up every hour. Once, I swore I heard something brushing against the outside wall, a dragging sound, but it stopped before I could sit up and really listen. I thought about going outside to check, but decided against it. If it was an animal, I'd scare it off in the morning. If it was a person, well, I didn't like that idea. The third day, I found something odd. I'd gone out to gather some wood from the pile, and there, right at the base of the back porch steps, was a small pile of dirt. Not kicked up, but poured, like someone had taken a shovel of fresh dirt and just dumped it there. It wasn't from the woods. This was soft, black dirt, like garden soil. I hadn't seen it the day before. I stood over it for a while, staring at it. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. It was too neat to be an animal. I checked the woods again, walked around the cabin. Nothing. No tracks, no sounds. I told myself maybe it had always been there, and I just didn't notice. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I laid in bed fully dressed, with my boots on, listening to the walls. Around 1 a.m., I heard that dragging sound again. Long, slow scrapes, like something being pulled through the dirt. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and stood near the window. I didn't see anything, but my mouth was dry. I kept waiting for something to move out in the trees. It didn't come, but in the morning, I found a second pile of dirt. This one was under the window. Same soft black soil, same little mound like it had been poured from a bucket. And next to it, I noticed a faint mark, almost like the edge of a shoe print. It was small, too small to be mine. Narrower. I stepped back and looked around again, heart racing. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but someone had been outside that cabin. Someone had come near the wall while I was sleeping. Twice. I grabbed my keys, threw my stuff in my bag, and made for the truck. I didn't care that I had another night booked. I wasn't staying. I jumped in, started the engine, and stopped cold. There was a third pile of dirt, right in front of the truck's driver's side door. Same black soil, same neat little mound. That's when I realized it wasn't random. Someone was putting them there on purpose. Watching, waiting. I drove straight back to Bronson. Didn't stop, didn't even look back. The roads were empty, and the whole way I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting someone to be sitting in the bed of the truck. At the gas station, I told the clerk about the cabin. She just shrugged and said the guy who owned it died years ago. She didn't know who was running it now. I checked into a roadside motel in a town 30 miles east and didn't leave the room for 2 days. I reported the incident to the sheriff's office when I got home. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I didn't press. I just wanted to forget it. But here's the thing. A month later, I was up late, unable to sleep. I pulled up the listing again. It was still active. Same photos, same price, but something was different. The new photo showed the backyard. For the first time, you could see the graveyard in the distance and something else. Near the tree line, in the shadows, there was a shape. Small, human-sized, squatting, maybe, watching the cabin. I closed the tab and never opened it again. I don't tell people this story anymore. Not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, but because I'm afraid they will. I never went back to Arkansas. Never stayed in another off-grid cabin. And to this day, I still check the ground outside my apartment window in the mornings, just to make sure there's no pile of dirt waiting for me. I was 32 years old when I took a job I probably shouldn't have taken. This was back in the fall of 2019. I had left my job in San Diego after a rough breakup and was just trying to reset. My cousin, who was working in Arizona at the time with a land surveying company, said they needed someone reliable to help with boundary documentation for a stretch of remote land near the New Mexico border. He didn't oversell it, said it was boring but peaceful work. I'd be checking fencing, measuring land plots, and staying in a small one-room cabin while I worked my way through a checklist of remote sites. The company rented this cabin from a local cattleman for workers to use during dry season surveys. It was about 20 miles from the nearest small town, and the roads were terrible. When I drove up there the first day in an old rented pickup, I had to take it slow over long stretches of gravel and dirt that hadn't been maintained in years. There weren't any houses nearby, just miles of open range, reddish dirt, and patches of juniper and scrub. Cell reception was gone after the first 15 miles. The cabin itself wasn't much. It was built with old dark logs, had a tin roof, and was just one room. There was a tiny outhouse about 20 yards behind it, and a pump-fed sink inside with questionable water pressure. The place had no electricity, just a gas lantern and a small propane heater for the colder nights. There were mouse droppings in the corners, and one of the windows had been taped up with cardboard. But I didn't mind. I brought my own food in a cooler, a folding cot, a hunting knife for protection, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had a pad of topo maps, a field book, and my GPS tools. I wasn't here to enjoy myself. I just wanted to work, earn some quiet, and sleep. For the first 3 days, nothing unusual happened. I would drive out each morning to one of the fence lines or plot corners and spend hours pacing back and forth over dry, uneven land, recording data, and marking the posts with fresh tags. In the evenings, I'd return to the cabin sore and sunburnt, eat cold food or heat akin over my little burner, then sleep early with the coyotes howling in the distance. By the fourth night, though, things started to get strange. That evening, I'd come back around 6:30 p.m. and notice something odd about the dirt out front. There were boot prints, big ones, leading up the steps of the cabin and back down again. That in itself wasn't too strange. Ranchers sometimes checked on this place, and someone might have stopped by while I was gone. But what caught my attention was how deep the prints were. They looked like someone had stood there for a long time, just standing facing the door. I checked the lock. It was fine. Nothing inside seemed out of place. I figured I was just letting my mind wander. I cleaned up, wrote in my logbook, and went to sleep. That night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. My flashlight was on the crate I used as a nightstand, and I clicked it on without thinking. The room was quiet, but there was a sound just outside, like footsteps on the gravel. Not walking, shifting, back and forth, like someone was turning in place. I didn't move. I lay on my cot for almost 20 minutes, not even blinking, just listening. Then the sound stopped. Dead silence. After another few minutes, I slowly sat up, pulled on my boots, and crept over to the door with the flashlight off. I didn't open it, just waited. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Sure enough, more prints. Again, deep. The same boots. They came up to the door, paused, then circled the cabin once, and walked off into the sagebrush. There was no vehicle, no tire tracks, just footprints. I told myself it was probably a ranch hand, maybe checking the area for cattle. But I had a weird feeling in my chest that made me pack my gear faster than usual. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin while working. Every hour or so, I'd glance back toward the ridge line to the west, thinking I'd see someone watching. I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I left the lantern off and sat against the back wall of the cabin with my knife and flashlight in hand. Nothing happened until almost 3 a.m. There was a knock at the door. Not loud, just a single heavy thud, like someone slowly tapping with the bottom of their fist. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again. Then it stopped. I stayed frozen for another hour, sweating and gripping my knife until the sun started to rise. I opened the door carefully, knife raised. The prints were there again, closer this time. Whoever it was had leaned close to the door, close enough for the prints to shift outward, like someone had bent at the waist. But again, no other sign of them. No vehicle, no tire tracks. That morning, I took a hike up the ridge where I had the best view of the valley. I wanted to see if I could spot a vehicle in the distance, or maybe a house I hadn't noticed before. But all I saw was empty land. Dirt, brush, low trees. Nothing but raw space. That night, I tried something different. I boiled water on the burner, poured it into an old metal pan, and slid it halfway under the cabin steps. I'd read somewhere that sometimes you can track prints better if the ground is damp. I sat in the dark, back against the wall again, and waited. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard it again. The steps, gravel shifting, this time slower, like whoever it was didn't care about making noise. I could hear each step, a crunch, then a long pause, then another. The steps stopped just in front of the cabin. I couldn't see anything. The cabin had no front-facing windows. Then there was a sound that chilled me to my core. A slow, low breathing, not quite a growl, just deep, drawn-out breaths, like someone trying to keep calm. And then scratching, very faint, like nails or fingers dragging slowly across the wood of the door. I didn't move. The sound stopped. I sat in the dark until sunrise, then went outside shaking. I checked the pan I'd left by the stairs. The dirt around it was torn up. Whoever had been there had stepped in it. The prints were clear, too clear, bare feet. They weren't boots this time. They were huge, wide, bare feet. Not clean either. The heels were cracked and the toes looked like they had scars or missing nails. The stride was strange too, like whoever made them had staggered or limped slightly. I felt sick. I told myself it was just some local, maybe on something. A drifter, someone mentally ill. That had to be it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with how he moved. Those prints didn't look like they belonged to someone used to walking barefoot. It looked painful. It looked forced. That day, I drove into the nearest town, just to get out of there for a few hours. I refilled my water and gas, sat in the truck at a gas station, and just stared at nothing for a while. I thought about telling someone, but what would I say? Hey, someone's walking around the cabin barefoot at 3 a.m. That wasn't illegal. It wasn't even enough to get someone to check it out. I drove back before dark and parked the truck so it was facing out, ready to leave quickly. I kept the key in my jacket pocket and left the cot folded up. I wasn't going to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I heard movement outside, but this time it wasn't slow or quiet. It was erratic. There was a thumping noise, then dragging, then a heavy stomp, like someone was pacing back and forth fast, angry. I held the knife tight and stared at the door, and then something slammed into the side of the cabin. Hard. Wood creaked. The whole wall shook. Then came a sound I'll never forget. It was a laugh, or something like it, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was wrong. It was forced, like someone who had never laughed before was trying to mimic one from memory. It was broken and uneven, like it didn't come from a human throat. Then it stopped, and everything went dead quiet. No wind.
No insects. No breathing.
I didn't leave that night. Couldn't move. I didn't even blink. At sunrise, I opened the door slowly. Nothing was there, but on the wall where the sound had come from, there were scratches. Deep ones, far deeper than fingernails could make, like something had been testing the logs. That was it. I packed my things in minutes, threw everything in the truck, slammed the door shut, and peeled out so fast the tires spat dirt everywhere. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't care about equipment. I just drove until I saw pavement again. I told my cousin I was done. He didn't ask questions. I never went back. The company didn't press me. They probably heard stranger stories out there. Over time, I convinced myself it was just a drifter, someone on something, maybe even a prankster who knew workers stayed there. But I think about those prints sometimes. The size, the stride, the way they changed from boots to bare feet, and that horrible broken laugh. Whatever it wasn't right. It wasn't normal. And it wasn't human, not in the way we understand it. I've never gone back to that part of Arizona since. I won't. Some places feel wrong for a reason. Some people, whatever they are, don't belong in daylight. And now I know why. My name is David. Back in the fall of 2013, I was 27 years old and trying to get my life together after a rough couple of years. I had gone through a breakup, quit a job I didn't care about, and moved out of the city to take a long break from people and everything that felt too loud. That October, my mom's older brother, Uncle Rob, let me stay at an old farm property he owned in eastern Nebraska, near a town called Elm Creek. He hadn't lived there in a long time, and the main house was falling apart. But there was a small wooden cabin in the back part of the land that still stood strong. Uncle Rob had used that little place as a kind of hunting retreat years ago, but he hadn't been out there in probably 8 or 9 years. When I first asked him if I could stay for a while, maybe a few weeks, he laughed and said, "It's yours if the raccoons haven't claimed it." I told him I'd be fine. I was looking for something quiet, isolated, and cheap. I didn't care about the condition. I packed up my truck, drove for about 6 hours west from Omaha, and pulled up to the old dirt road that led to the cabin. There was no gate, just a rusted-out mailbox with the numbers barely visible. Weeds had grown high around the gravel entrance, and tree branches hung low enough that I had to duck my head as I drove through. The land was massive, maybe 100 acres, but it felt completely forgotten. The fields were overgrown with dry corn stalks that had never been harvested, and the barn out front was half collapsed. The main farmhouse was barely standing, too, its front porch tilted like it had sunk into the dirt. I didn't bother going inside. I just kept driving toward the back, where the land sloped down a bit and the trees started getting thicker. The cabin sat just beyond that line of trees, hidden from the road and the house. It was smaller than I remembered from when I'd seen it once as a kid. It was just one room with a wood stove, a creaky bed, and a table with a few chairs. There was no running water, no power. A few spiders had made homes in the corners, and I saw mouse droppings near the baseboards, but other than that, it was in decent shape. It smelled like old wood, dirt, and mildew, but nothing unbearable. I aired it out, cleaned it as best I could, and moved my stuff in. I brought a camping lantern, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, a bunch of canned food, and a small propane burner. I kept a .38 revolver in my duffel just in case. Not because I expected trouble, but because I'd be out in the middle of nowhere for weeks. Seemed smart. The first few days were peaceful. I woke with the sun, hiked around the overgrown land, picked wild apples, and sometimes just sat on the old log bench out front, drinking coffee from a tin cup and listening to the birds. It was the most alone I had ever been, and it felt right. No one knew where I was, and for the first time in a while, I didn't care. But things started to shift after about the 5th day. I remember it clearly, because I had just finished boiling some water for coffee when I heard something strange near the tree line. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through dry leaves. I froze, held my breath, and listened. It stopped just as suddenly as it started. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe a fallen branch rolling down the slope. I didn't think much of it, but that night I kept waking up. Every few hours, I'd sit up in my sleeping bag and look out the window. I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed close by the cabin. The next morning, I went out back to relieve myself and noticed something that didn't sit right. About 10 yards from the cabin, in a patch of soft dirt, there was a shallow track. Not a boot print, not a tire mark, just a long, curved line, like something had been dragged. It reminded me of when you pull a bag of feed or a tarp through the dust. Clean, single trail. I followed it for a few feet, but it vanished into the undergrowth. I told myself it was probably a wild animal dragging something, maybe a deer carcass. Still, I didn't feel easy. That night, I loaded the revolver and kept it next to me in the sleeping bag. The nights kept getting worse. Around midnight, I'd hear faint rustling. Not wind, not branches creaking. It sounded more like someone moving around just outside. Slow steps, a pause, then a few more steps, always just far enough away that I couldn't tell the direction. Sometimes I'd think it was behind the cabin. Then suddenly it would sound like it was near the front. I never heard it run. It never made a loud noise. It was always soft, careful, patient. On the 8th night, I heard something touch the door. Not bang, not knock, just a soft scrape, like nails or claws dragging lightly across the wood. I sat up, heart racing, and waited. I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was the wind. Then I heard it again, just slower. A long, drawn-out scratch from top to bottom. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against the wall, revolver in my lap, eyes fixed on the door. I kept waiting for it to open. It never did. The scratch never came back. But I didn't move. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and looked around. The dirt near the front door was smooth. No prints, no drag marks, nothing. Like whatever was there had taken extra care not to leave a trace. I thought about leaving that morning. I had enough gas to make it to town. I could have driven to a motel, stayed there for a few nights and cleared my head. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. I stayed. That was a mistake. On the 10th night, something changed. It rained hard all day, and by evening the ground was soaked. I chopped some wood and brought it inside early, knowing I'd need to keep the stove going. As night fell, I could hear the wind picking up outside, and the trees creaked louder than usual. But there were no animal sounds.
No owls. No insects.
Just rain and wind. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not distant, not cautious. These were clear, wet, heavy steps in the mud. Squish, squish, squish. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I held the revolver and stood near the window, peeking out through the slats in the boarded-up frame. At first, I didn't see anything. Then something moved. At the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet out, I saw a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. He wore a long coat, soaked and dark, and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. I could barely see his face, but he wasn't moving. He just stood there, watching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood still and waited. After maybe 10 minutes, he turned and walked back into the trees, slowly disappearing into the black. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I went out and checked the ground. Sure enough, muddy footprints led from the tree line to the front of the cabin. They stopped about 10 feet from the door, then turned around. There was no vehicle, no tire tracks, no sign of anyone driving in. I packed everything that morning. I threw my gear in the truck and drove straight to the nearest gas station, where I sat for an hour, just shaking. I called Uncle Rob when I got into town and told him what happened. He went quiet, then said something I'll never forget. "Yeah, that's why I stopped going there." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. I knew that whatever had been around that cabin, it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a person, a real person, someone who knew the land better than me, someone who watched me night after night and never made a sound, someone who waited until it rained to get close, so I wouldn't hear them coming. I never went back to that farm. Uncle Rob passed away in 2018, and the land was sold off. I heard the new owner bulldoze the cabin and put up a storage building in its place. I haven't been alone in the woods since. I still go hiking sometimes, but I stick to busy trails. I stay in public campgrounds, and I never stay where there's no cell service, because I know what it feels like to be watched, to be circled, to be studied in the dark by someone who doesn't want to be seen. And I know that if I'd stayed just one more night, I might not be here to tell you this story. It was late September of 2019 when I drove up to the old cabin in rural Vermont. I'd taken a week off work after a rough patch in my personal life. Things had been falling apart slowly. My relationship ended. I left the apartment I'd shared with my girlfriend, and I was feeling mentally drained. My friend Kevin had told me about his uncle's unused hunting cabin up in a quiet wooded stretch near Peacham. He said I could use it for a few days just to get away and reset. It wasn't in the best shape, but it had electricity, running water, and a working fireplace. That's all I really needed. I was 31, a warehouse supervisor in New Jersey, and I'd never spent much time in the woods by myself. I had some basic camping experience, but this was different. I was going to be alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, in a cabin that hadn't been used in over a year. But at that point, I needed solitude more than anything else. I arrived on a cloudy Tuesday morning. The road up to the cabin was narrow and uneven, covered in patches of gravel and fallen leaves. Trees lined both sides, thick and close. I kept losing the signal on my phone and eventually shut it off to save battery. The cabin came into view around a bend, a small wooden structure with a slanted roof, a single chimney, and a rusted tin porch cover that flapped slightly in the wind. It looked like it had weathered a lot of seasons without much care. I parked in the patch of overgrown grass out front, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the steps. The porch creaked under my weight. The key Kevin gave me worked, though I had to jiggle it a few times. Inside, the cabin smelled musty but not rotten. It was just the smell of old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area, a single couch with worn-out cushions, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. I opened the windows to let the air move and started unpacking my stuff. By mid-afternoon, I had things set up. I brought a cooler with food and a camping stove just in case the power didn't hold up. But when I flipped the light switches, they worked. The fridge made noise. Water ran when I turned the tap, and the heater kicked in with a bit of a groan. I chopped some kindling from the woodpile behind the cabin and made a small fire in the stove more for comfort than warmth. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of the time reading, walking around the property, and writing in a notebook. The quiet was strange at first, so silent that I noticed every leaf rustle and branch snap. At night, the trees would creak in the wind, and sometimes I'd hear animals moving around. Once, I heard what I assumed was a deer walking past the window, its hooves crunching leaves. That kind of thing was easy to explain away. But on Thursday night, something changed. It was around 11 p.m. I turned off the lights and was in bed, tucked under the heavy blanket. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside scratched faintly against the cabin. I was just starting to doze off when I heard a knock. Not loud, just a short, dull thump against the front door. Then silence. I lay still, holding my breath. A minute passed, then another knock. Same as before. Not hard, not fast, just a flat thump like someone pressing their knuckles once against the wood. I told myself it was probably the wind. Maybe something hanging loose on the porch hit the door. I got up quietly, walked barefoot through the dark cabin, and peeked out the small window next to the front door. Nothing, just the empty porch and trees swaying beyond it. I locked the door just in case and went back to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again, this time from a sharp noise. It sounded like something scraped along the outside wall, maybe a branch dragged by the wind. I stayed in bed and listened. Nothing else happened. I fell asleep again eventually. The next morning, I walked around the cabin checking for anything unusual. On the far side of the building, I saw long, fresh scratches on the wood siding. They were low to the ground, maybe 2 feet up and jagged. Could have been from a big dog or a coyote. Couldn't be sure. I didn't see any prints, but the ground was covered with leaves. I shrugged it off, though I felt a little unsettled. That night, I locked all the windows and turned off the lights early. I kept a heavy flashlight next to the bed and a small hunting knife in my bag nearby, just for peace of mind. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like my body stayed alert even when my mind tried to relax. Around midnight, I was still awake, lying on my side, when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, wood creaking under weight. Then they stopped. Another knock, this time a little louder. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't move for a while, just listened. The knock didn't come again. I crept to the window, eased the curtain back, and looked out. Still nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the porch and the edge of the woods beyond. I stayed up the rest of that night. Every sound made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard someone or something breathing just outside the wall, near the bedroom. But it could have been wind or an animal. I didn't sleep. The following day, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. I wanted to believe I was just scaring myself. It was an old cabin in the woods, after all. These noises probably happened all the time. Maybe I just wasn't used to it. Still, I felt watched, like the trees had eyes. That afternoon, I walked deeper into the woods than I had before. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin, past the woodpile, down a slope toward a dry creek bed. The trees were dense and tall, casting long shadows. About a mile in, I found an old broken fence, just a few leaning wooden posts and some rusted wire. It looked like it had once marked a boundary. Beyond it was an overgrown path leading uphill. Curiosity pushed me further. I walked about 10 more minutes until I came across what looked like an abandoned trailer, half sunk into the earth. The windows were busted, the door hung open, and graffiti covered the side. Names, dates, and crude drawings. A pile of beer cans sat nearby, rusted and crushed. It looked like kids had partied there at some point, maybe years ago. Inside, the trailer was trashed. Broken furniture, rotting cushions, and scattered clothes littered the floor. I didn't stay long, but before I left, I saw something carved into the wall near the back window. It read, "Keep away from cabin." The letters were rough, uneven, scratched in with a knife or nail. My mouth went dry. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, trying to decide if it was some prank or something meant seriously. Eventually, I turned and hiked back, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I kept the lights off, sat on the couch with the flashlight on my lap, and listened. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement again, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling slowly outside. Then the back door rattled. Just once. A small sound. A test. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The door didn't open. Nothing broke. Just silence again. But I knew then that someone was out there, watching, waiting. As the sky began to lighten outside, I packed up everything I could quickly. I didn't eat, didn't wash, didn't even change. I threw my stuff into the car, locked the cabin, and backed down the long gravel road without looking back. I didn't tell anyone for a while. When Kevin asked if I enjoyed the trip, I just said it was peaceful but not for me. I didn't mention the knocks, the footsteps, the scratches, or the trailer in the woods. But 2 weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for incidents near Peacham or abandoned trailers in the forest nearby. I didn't find much, but on a local message board, I came across an old thread about a man who had squatted in that area for years. Someone wrote that he used to live in a trailer deep in the woods and didn't like strangers. They said a hunter once spotted him standing outside cabins in the early morning, just staring at them. No one could prove anything, and he was never caught or charged with anything violent. But after a few unsettling encounters, he just seemed to disappear. I don't know if he's still out there. Maybe he left, maybe he died, or maybe he's still wandering around those woods at night, knocking quietly to see who answers. But I do know one thing. If I had opened the door that night, even just a crack, I don't think I would have made it home. My name is Aaron Welch. In 2019, I worked as a park ranger in a little-known section of the Rocky Mountains, about 5 hours west of Fort Collins, Colorado. I was 32 at the time, single, and had been with the U.S. Forest Service for almost 6 years. I'd worked in Oregon, Arizona, and Utah before, but Colorado was where I thought I'd stay for a while. The landscape here was quieter, more isolated, and less crowded than the national parks I'd been assigned to before. I liked that. Less foot traffic, fewer city folks asking dumb questions, and more peace. Most of my days were spent doing fire checks, trail inspections, basic maintenance, and patrolling campgrounds. I was usually stationed at a ranger post halfway up a mountain range called the Addington Peaks. But in October of that year, I was asked to do a solo rotation for 2 weeks at a fire watch cabin located farther out, around 11 miles from the nearest service road. The cabin was perched on a rocky ridge, surrounded by old pine and spruce, built back in the 1950s during the Cold War as part of a lookout system. It was rarely used anymore. Just once or twice a year, usually in the fall, someone would stay there to check radio signals, clear brush, and make sure the structure hadn't rotted through. This time, that person was me. I brought my dog, Milo, with me. He was a 6-year-old German Shepherd. Smart, well-trained, and probably better at spotting danger than I was. I always took him with me when I did remote assignments like this. Technically, dogs weren't allowed on official duty, but I bent the rules out here. No one ever checked. I loaded a week's worth of supplies into a Forest Service truck and drove as far as I could before switching to an ATV and finishing the last leg of the trip on foot. The weather had started to turn. The first snowfall of the season had dusted the higher peaks, and at night, the temperatures dropped below freezing. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it looked just like I remembered from training: gray, square, and plain. A metal roof, heavy wooden shutters over the windows, and a narrow porch that faced the south slope. The air smelled like dry pine needles and cold earth. Inside, the place was dusty but still sturdy. One room with a bunk, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a steel cabinet with backup radios, first aid kits, and flare rounds. In the corner sat an old propane fridge and a water drum half full. The cabin had no power, just battery lanterns and solar panels that charged a single floodlight near the door. It was simple, but enough. The first few days were normal. I logged trail markers, cleared brush from the watchtower steps, tested the radio twice daily, and kept an eye on distant lightning strikes. I checked my maps, documented animal tracks, and wrote boring reports no one would read. Milo stayed close the whole time. At night, he curled up near the stove while I read old ranger logs or made jerky and beans over the fire. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't even hear coyotes. The first strange thing happened on the 4th night. I'd gone to bed around 9 p.m. after doing my final perimeter check. No signs of anything unusual.
No footprints, no vehicles.
The wind had picked up a bit, making the trees creak outside, but nothing crazy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, heart racing. Milo was standing at the door, ears stiff, body tense. He didn't growl or bark, just stared. It wasn't a full moon, but enough moonlight filtered through the shutters to let me see his outline. He was focused on something outside. I slipped on my boots and coat and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, I unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had stopped. It was dead silent. I waited a minute, sweeping my flashlight across the trees, down the ridge, toward the old gravel path that led to the valley. Nothing. No movement, no sounds. But Milo wouldn't come out. He stayed in the doorway, watching. I figured maybe he heard a bear in the distance. It wasn't uncommon this time of year. Some of them hung around longer than they should. I scanned the tree-line again, then went back inside and bolted the door. The next morning, I checked for tracks. Nothing fresh. No bear prints, no paw marks. Just my own boot prints from the day before. I let it go, but then things got worse. That afternoon, while checking the trail camera about a mile north of the cabin, I noticed something odd. The camera had been knocked sideways, not completely off, just tilted down as if something had smacked it from above. The strap around the tree was still tight. I adjusted it and checked the memory card. Later, back at the cabin, I plugged the card into the reader and flipped through the photos. Most were what you'd expect: deer, a few elk, and shadows moving across the forest floor. But then there was one that stood out. It was taken at 3:27 a.m. the night before. The image was blurry, but there was a figure in it. Not an animal, person. The figure stood in the trees, maybe 20 feet from the trail, wearing dark clothing, not facing the camera directly. It was grainy, but you could tell it wasn't a hunter or hiker.
No backpack. No gear.
Just a man standing there in the woods in the middle of the night. That trail led nowhere. The closest road was over 8 miles away, through rough terrain. No one should have been out there. I felt that slow, sick twist in my gut. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, keeping the stove going and watching the windows. I kept the light off and sat in the dark with Milo at my feet. He was quiet but alert. Every few minutes he'd lift his head, ears twitching at something I couldn't hear. The next day, I hiked the area near the trail cam and looked for prints. I found one, a boot print, just one, not mine. It was deeper than mine, too. Whoever left it was heavier or carrying something. I radioed it in, told the base I'd found signs of trespassing near the northern ridge and wanted to extend my stay a few extra days. They said fine. It wasn't unusual to have someone get lost or go off-grid, but I knew better. This didn't feel random. That night, I moved the table in front of the door. I slid the bolt across and kept my .308 on the bunk next to me. I didn't sleep. At around 1:45 a.m., Milo started growling. This time, it was a low, steady growl, coming from deep in his chest. His nose was pointed toward the wall facing the woods. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the window to the left. Then I heard the crunch of leaves. Someone was outside, not walking, just one step, then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. My heart thumped in my ears. I thought maybe I imagined it, but Milo didn't. He kept growling, head low, tail still. Another step, closer now, right outside the window. I kept staring at the wall, waiting for the sound of the window latch or the creak of the porch. Nothing came. Then the steps moved again, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Clockwise, 1, 2, 3, then silence. The next hour was the longest of my life. When daylight finally came, I opened the door and looked around. There were no tracks, no prints, no signs, just that same dead silence in the trees. I knew I had to make a decision. I could hike out early and report it. But something told me this wasn't just a lost hiker. This felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. So I stayed. That afternoon, I hiked to the ridge and used the satellite phone to call base. I told them I needed a replacement to rotate in early. They said they could send someone in 2 days. I said okay. The next night was worse. It was colder. Milo wouldn't eat. He stayed pressed against the door the entire time. Around 3:10 a.m., I heard something again. It wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, right outside the wall. Deep, slow breaths, in and out. Then a sharp thud against the siding. I gripped my rifle, stepped toward the wall, and banged the butt of it hard against the wood. Silence. Whatever or whoever it was didn't run. They just stopped. Then I heard it walk off, slow and steady, until the sound disappeared into the trees. At first light, I hiked the area. Again, no tracks, no prints. But this time, I noticed something. A small tuft of black fabric caught on a branch just 30 feet from the cabin. It looked like torn jacket nylon. I bagged it and made a note. That evening, I packed up early. I didn't wait for the replacement. I left a note, secured the cabin, and hiked down before sunset. I didn't stop once on the trail. I kept Milo leash tight and didn't look back. I made it to the service road and waited 3 hours for pickup. I didn't care. I wasn't going back up there. 2 weeks later, they sent a new ranger to check on the cabin. He found the door cracked open. The bolt latch was torn off. Inside, the table had been flipped. The flare gun was missing. No signs of who did it. They closed the cabin after that. It's been sealed ever since. They said maybe it was a bear, maybe a squatter, maybe a drifter, but I know what I felt out there. That wasn't random. That wasn't wildlife. It was a person, and they knew I was alone. They watched, they waited, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I still work for the Forest Service, but I don't go up the Addington Peaks anymore. Not even close. And Milo? He never slept the same after that. Neither did I. My name's Rick Holden. I was 43 years old when all this happened. It was fall of 2018, mid-October, when the leaves in upstate Pennsylvania were dry and crackling under every step. I'd been working construction jobs most of my adult life, but after I got divorced 2 years earlier, I started doing more solo stuff, things to keep me away from people. I used to fish with my brother, hunt in the winter, hike during spring. But once my ex-wife and I split, I found myself drifting into quieter, more isolated habits. That's how I ended up finding out about that cabin. A friend of mine, Kyle, used to be a state trooper up in Elk County. He mentioned once over a drink that there were old cabins up there that hadn't been used in years. They were part of an old Pennsylvania State Police training program back in the 70s. Apparently, troopers used to stay in them for wilderness survival training or sometimes just stakeouts when things were going down near the border of the state forest. I was interested, not because of any weird stories or anything. I just liked the idea of being left alone. I'd been burned out from the last 3 months of work on a bridge repair outside of Altoona and needed a break. I figured a week up in the mountains, near a forgotten cabin that barely anyone remembered, would do me good. Kyle gave me a rough sketch on paper of where the place was. It wasn't listed online. It wasn't in any registry. It wasn't exactly legal to be in there either, I guess, but Kyle said nobody checked that spot anymore. The roads were washed out a long time ago. I had a 4-wheel drive pickup and figured I could make it as far as needed and hike the rest. So one Thursday morning, I left my place in Lewistown, packed my gear. Mostly simple stuff. Tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, axe, food, my old rifle just in case of bears. I had a Glock too, but that was more for peace of mind than anything else. Took me about 5 hours to get near the area Kyle had marked. The roads got narrower the farther I went. Trees started closing in, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel of branches. By late afternoon, I parked on the side of an overgrown logging path and hiked the rest. Took a little under an hour, and then I found it. The cabin sat back about 20 yards from the edge of a small clearing. It was old, not falling apart, but the roof sagged on one end and the door was leaning on loose hinges. It was made of thick pine logs, darkened over the years, with a brick chimney rising crooked out of the roof. Ivy had started creeping up the side of it. No signs of animals nesting inside, though. I pushed the door open. It gave a loud groan. The inside smelled like dust, wet wood, and something faintly metallic. Not blood or anything like that, just old. The floor creaked under me. There were a couple of rusted metal chairs, a steel desk bolted to the wall, and one heavy iron stove with a busted door. A rack for rifles hung crookedly above a wooden bench. The weird thing, though, was the bulletin board on the back wall. It still had some old papers pinned to it. One was a faded map, maybe from the 1980s. Another was a handwritten log, almost like someone kept watch here for weeks at a time. Names of troopers, dates, short notes like "no movement today" or "tracks northbound near ridge." Some were scratched out, others circled in pencil. It wasn't creepy, just strange how it was all still there, like whoever used the cabin just got up and left one day and never came back. I didn't think too much of it. I set up my stuff, swept out most of the dust, and even managed to get a fire going in the stove after I patched the door with a bit of scrap metal I had in my gear. That first night was peaceful. Cold, but peaceful. The wind blew outside, and the trees moaned, but nothing out of the ordinary. Second day, I spent time chopping firewood from a couple dead trees out back. I hiked around the area a bit, not too far, maybe 2 miles radius. I found some old shell casings near the edge of a dry creek bed. Probably from training, I figured. Shotgun and .308 rounds. Nothing fresh. No footprints. It was quiet. So quiet it actually made my ears ring sometimes. That level of quiet starts playing tricks on you. You start hearing things. Small things that aren't really there. By the third night, something felt off. Not scary, not at first. Just off. I was sitting on that stiff bench by the stove, carving a stick out of boredom. The fire crackled. My back ached. Then I heard the sound outside. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely not an animal. It was slow, deliberate, like someone stepping on dry leaves very carefully. I froze. My ears were on high alert. I didn't move for almost a full minute. Then it stopped. I stood up and walked to the door, opened it slowly. I scanned the clearing, flashlight in one hand, Glock in the other. Nothing. I even walked out toward the tree line. Still nothing. No prints, no signs. I felt stupid. Probably just a deer stepping wrong. Maybe even the trees shedding heavier branches. Next morning, I walked around the back of the cabin just to double check. That's when I saw it. There were fresh boot prints in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Not mine. They were wider, deeper. Someone heavier than me. Maybe 230 or 240 pounds. They led from the woods to the cabin's rear wall, stopped directly beneath the one window that overlooked the stove, and then disappeared again into the brush. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave. I still had 3 more days planned. But my gut told me someone had been watching me the night before. Someone close. Too close. I kept the Glock holstered on my hip the whole day after that. I still chopped more wood, but I stayed close. Real close. Every time the wind rustled through the leaves, I looked up fast. Every squirrel sounded like a footstep. Later that day, I checked the cabin for any other signs. Under the desk, I found an old locker. It was heavy and locked tight. Took me nearly an hour to break it open with a pry bar. Inside was nothing but folders, state police case files from decades ago. Most of them were moldy or chewed through by mice, but some were still readable. They weren't training reports. These were surveillance files, pictures paper-clipped to pages, names, locations, even timestamps. One file mentioned a man named Curtis J. Flynn, born 1954, known for anti-government activity, suspected of squatting in state land. The last report was dated 1991. Last known location, Southeast Elk Forest, potentially armed. Avoid contact without backup. And that was it. Nothing more. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man had never left, or someone else like him. Maybe someone found this cabin long before me and made it theirs. That night, the footsteps came back. I was already in bed, half asleep, when I heard them again, closer this time, right outside the front door. I sat up fast and stayed quiet. I didn't move a muscle. I listened. A minute passed, then another. Then came a sound I'll never forget. The front door latch lifted. It didn't open, just lifted. Quiet, careful, like someone was testing if it was locked. I reached for the Glock beside me, chambered around slowly. I stayed completely still, my back against the cold log wall. Then silence again. 10 minutes passed. 20. I didn't sleep a second that night. In the morning, I walked the perimeter again. More prints, the same heavy boots, this time circling the cabin, weaving in and out of trees. No trash, no gear left behind. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen, didn't want to make a mess. I packed my things quickly. By noon, I had everything loaded into my pack and started the hike back to my truck. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just walked. About halfway to the truck, I stopped. Ahead of me, maybe 40 yards up the path, was a man. He was standing completely still, wearing a tan jacket, pants too baggy, and a cap pulled down low. His face was in shadow. He didn't move, just watched me. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my weapon. I didn't want to escalate it. I turned off the path, moved downhill through thick brush. I hiked cross-country for nearly an hour, backtracking, doubling around, moving quiet as I could. I didn't get back to the truck until almost sunset. I slammed the door, locked it, started the engine, and got out of there. I didn't stop driving until I hit Route 219. Then I kept going until I was back in Lewistown. I told Kyle everything. He just nodded and didn't say much. I think he knew those woods had stories in them. He told me one thing before I left his place. Some of those old cabins were never meant to be used again. I never went back, never looked into Curtis Flynn, never told anyone else. I still go camping, but not alone, and never anywhere that doesn't show up on a real map. And sometimes, late at night, when I think back on it, I realize something that still chills me. That man didn't come to the cabin the first night. He didn't just find me out there. He was already there, watching, waiting. It was the summer of 2017 when I took a break from work and decided to go up into the mountains for a quiet weekend alone. I had been working nonstop in Sacramento, and things were piling up in my head. Projects, deadlines, stress, bad sleep. I needed something that felt more real, something simple. I'd always liked being outdoors, and I figured 2 nights in a rented cabin near the Sierra Buttes would be a good way to recharge. I found a listing for a small, private cabin on a quiet piece of land off a narrow back road near Downeyville, California. The photos were simple: wood walls, an old bed, a little porch that looked out into the trees. No Wi-Fi, no TV, barely even cell service. That was the appeal. I booked it for Friday through Sunday. It was listed under the name of an older guy named Harold who lived a few miles away and managed a few places like it. We exchanged a couple messages, and that was that. I left early Friday morning in my truck and reached the cabin around 1 p.m. The dirt road that led to it was rough, full of ruts and stones, and my tires kicked up a lot of dust. The trees got thicker the farther I drove, mostly pines and firs. Eventually the road opened into a small flat clearing, and there it was, the cabin. A single-room wooden structure with a metal roof and a little chimney. A fire ring sat out front. It was older than the photos made it seem, and it gave off a weird stillness, like nobody had stayed there in a long time. But it was what I had come for, quiet. I parked and got out. The air smelled like dust and pine sap. The only sound was a few birds up in the trees and the occasional creaking of wood when the wind moved through. I carried my cooler, sleeping bag, and backpack inside. The floor was uneven in spots, and the windows were small and didn't have screens. There was an old propane heater against the wall and a small sink that didn't work. Harold had told me to bring my own water. The back door led to an old outhouse about 30 feet behind the cabin. Once I settled in, I sat on the porch for a while with a can of beer and stared out into the woods. I didn't see any other houses, no hikers, no cars, just trees. The air was warm, but not too hot. Felt good. After a couple hours, I got up and walked a short trail Harold had told me about. It led to a small rocky overlook where you could see the valley. I took a few photos and headed back before it got dark. That night, I made a fire and ate some canned chili with bread. I read a little by headlamp and got into my sleeping bag early. The night was completely quiet except for the wind in the trees. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard something walking around outside. Maybe an animal. But I didn't hear it again, so I went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a thick gray sky. A storm was moving in, and the air smelled damp. I didn't mind the weather. I spent most of the morning reading and making simple food. Around noon, it started raining. Hard. It wasn't just a drizzle. It was cold, fast rain with wind behind it. I stayed inside and watched the trees bend in the gusts. The roof creaked a lot. At one point, I thought I heard something thump lightly against the back of the cabin, like a branch maybe, but when I looked out, I couldn't see anything. Then sometime around 4 p.m., I went outside to go to the outhouse. I put on my raincoat and stepped around the side of the cabin. The rain had let up just a bit, and I stood there for a second looking at the tree line. That's when I noticed it. Muddy footprints leading away from the outhouse and disappearing into the woods behind it. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked back there since I arrived, and even if I had, they wouldn't look like that. They were fresh. The shape was narrow, boot-shaped. Not big, not small. They weren't deep, but they were clear enough to make out the tread pattern. I just stood there staring at them. I looked around the trees, but everything was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind just then. I couldn't explain it, but something in me tightened up. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I went back inside, locked the front door, and pulled the curtains closed. The rain picked back up again. I tried to tell myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hiker had passed through earlier in the day. Maybe Harold had been around. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a single person, and the road leading in was narrow enough that I would have noticed another vehicle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, faint tapping on the wall. Every time I heard something, I'd sit up and listen, heart racing. Around 11 p.m., I heard a long scrape along the side of the cabin. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something or someone dragging something along the wood panels. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark for a while, trying to calm down. I eventually drifted into a light sleep, but I kept waking up. Then, just before dawn, I opened my eyes to a faint gray light coming through the curtains. I sat up and looked toward the window on the far side of the room. There was a mark on the glass. At first, I thought it was just moisture, but when I got closer, I saw it was a smear, like something oily had been pressed against it and then dragged downward. I couldn't make out a shape exactly, but it looked like maybe a handprint, though not a full one. Just the edge of fingers. It hadn't been there the day before. That was it. I started packing. I threw everything in my bag, stuffed the sleeping bag back into its sack, and didn't even bother with breakfast. I opened the door and looked around. The forest was completely still again. No sound. The rain had stopped, but the air was wet and cold. As I walked to my truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were more footprints, not just at the outhouse this time. They were around the cabin, at least 5 or 6 different ones. They looped around the sides, even passed under the window with the smear on it. They weren't deep, just shallow mud impressions, but they were spaced like someone had been walking slowly, deliberately. I didn't count all of them. I didn't want to. I got into the truck and turned the engine over. Took a second to start, which scared the hell out of me. Once it was running, I backed out fast, almost hit a stump, and turned down the dirt road without looking back. About halfway down, I saw something strange on the right side of the trail. Someone had stacked a small pile of stones next to a tree, 5 flat rocks arranged in a neat little pyramid. I hadn't seen that on the way in. It looked recent. The rocks were clean and shiny from the rain. I kept driving. When I got to the highway, I pulled over at a gas station about 15 minutes away and sat there for a while. I didn't call anyone. I didn't go to the police. What was I going to say? Someone walked around my cabin in the rain and left some footprints? There hadn't been any damage. Nobody had touched me, but I knew something was off out there. Someone had been watching the place. Maybe they still were. I drove back to Sacramento that morning and didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. I kept thinking about those footprints, the handprint on the glass, the scrape on the wall. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. A week later, I went back to the listing site to leave a review and noticed the cabin had been taken down. I messaged Harold, but I never got a reply. His other listings disappeared after that too. I haven't gone back to the Sierra Buttes since. I don't even like driving near them now. Something about that weekend still sits in my chest like a heavy stone. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Someone was out there watching me, moving around that cabin in the dark and rain. They didn't break in. They didn't leave a message. They just let me know in their own quiet way that I wasn't alone. That's what scares me the most. Not ghosts or monsters or stories you hear around a fire. Just the quiet kind of people who watch from the trees and don't say a word. I don't talk about this much. It was back in 2013 when I was 34. My name's Mark Reynolds, and I was living alone in a small town called Lewiston in northern Idaho. I had taken a break from my work as a welder due to some back issues and a long, bitter divorce that ended the year before. I needed time to reset. Time away from people, bills, courtrooms, and the noise of everyday life. So I decided to spend a few weeks alone in the woods, something I hadn't done since my 20s. I'd found this cabin listing in a forum for outdoor rentals, not on Airbnb or anything official. It was an older man, Jerry something, who owned a plot of land up on Little Bear Ridge, about 45 miles outside of town. He had a small off-grid cabin he built back in the 80s. No power, no running water, but it was secluded and the rent was cheap, just $200 for 2 weeks if I brought my own supplies. I took the deal without a second thought. I was used to roughing it from hunting trips and figured it'd be good for my head. The road up there was steep and winding, just a narrow gravel path for the last 10 miles that twisted through tall pine forest and dry rocky outcroppings. I drove my old Chevy Tahoe packed full with supplies, canned food, a few gallons of water, camping gear, a .45 revolver, and a couple books I hadn't had time to read in years. The weather was clear that first day. Sunny, dry air. Late September. Leaves were starting to turn gold and brown. The kind of time that makes the forest feel open and peaceful. The cabin itself was small. Just a square box of rough-cut logs and a tin roof, with a little porch on the front and a rusted steel chimney poking out one side. Inside was just a single room, with stove in the corner, an old metal-framed cot with a foam mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf of canned food left behind. Mice had chewed through a few. It smelled like dry wood, dust, and old pine sap. No one had been in there for a while. Behind the cabin, a narrow game trail led up a slope into the thicker woods. The trees were dense but not dark. More yellow than green that time of year. I saw plenty of deer scat and 1 fresh elk track. I took a piss by a boulder and noticed a weathered axe half buried in a pile of pine needles. Looked like someone had been cutting firewood years ago and just left it there to rust. The first few days were uneventful, just how I wanted. I cut some firewood from the old logs near the cabin and kept the stove going at night. During the day, I hiked around the ridge, scouted for sign, even thought about hunting though I didn't bring my tags. I cooked beans and rice on a propane stove, wrote in a notebook, read through an old paperback on Western gunfights, and stared out into the woods for hours at a time. The silence out there is different. It wraps around you like water. I slept well for the first time in months. But then, around the 5th day, things started to feel off. Started small. One morning, I stepped outside and found a cigarette, but near the woodpile. I don't smoke. It was fresh, not weathered. Still smelled like menthol. I figured maybe I just missed it when I arrived, or Jerry, the owner, had been there a few days before me. No big deal. But later that same day, I noticed the lock on the cabin door didn't feel right. It was one of those cheap padlocks on a metal hasp. It had been clicking firmly before, but now it stuck halfway through and the shackle had a thin scratch like someone tried forcing it with a tool. I felt my gut tense up. I checked inside. Nothing was missing. My food, my pistol, everything looked untouched. I started locking the door more carefully when I went on hikes. I also began watching the treeline more often. By the 7th day, I started waking up at night, hearing soft sounds outside. At first, it was just dry leaves crunching or the wind knocking a branch loose. But once, I heard what sounded like deliberate footsteps. Heavy ones, slow and spaced out. Not a deer. Too deliberate for that. I got up, grabbed my flashlight and revolver, and stepped out onto the porch in my long johns. I swept the beam through the trees and saw nothing, just thick trunks and falling pine needles. The next morning I checked for tracks but didn't see anything clear. I tried to convince myself it was a bear, or a moose maybe, but I'd heard both before, and they don't move that way. Not careful, not slow. I decided to cut my stay short and leave the next morning. But I had one more night to get through. It rained hard that afternoon. A cold, steady pour that turned the dirt around the cabin into mud. The metal roof clicked and groaned all evening. I stayed inside, writing and listening. As the sun set, the air got thick and gray. I made a fire in the stove and cooked some soup. Around 10 p.m., I laid down and tried to sleep. The wind had died by then. The forest was dead still. I woke up sometime after midnight, not sure what time. The fire had gone out, and the air was cold. I heard something outside. Not footsteps this time. Something scraping. A long, slow drag across the wall of the cabin, like metal on wood. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I didn't move for a long time. I just listened. It scraped again, higher up. Maybe by the window. I grabbed the revolver and my flashlight, took a deep breath, and went to the window. I didn't open it. I just crouched down and peeked through the edge of the curtain. There was someone out there. I didn't see a face, just the side of a body. A man, wearing dark clothing. He had something in his hand, long metal, a crowbar maybe. He was facing the wall and running the bar up and down the logs like he was feeling the structure. I pulled back and froze. I don't know how long I sat there. Probably 5 minutes, maybe 10. My brain was racing. Should I yell? Should I fire a warning shot? Should I wait? He hadn't tried the door yet. Then I heard something else. Another set of steps. Lighter, quicker. There were 2 of them. I felt sick. My mind was moving too fast to make a plan. I didn't want to shoot unless I had to, but I also knew I was alone. No cell service.
No neighbors.
No help. I slid back toward the cot and got down low. I kept the gun aimed at the door, trying to control my breathing. They never knocked, never spoke, just walked slowly around the cabin. I heard one of them on the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. Then I heard the door latch jiggle softly. I had locked it, but it wasn't a strong lock. I raised the gun and aimed. The latch jiggled again, then stopped. Nothing happened for a while. Eventually, I heard the creak of the porch again. Then nothing at all. Silence. I waited there with the gun in my hand until the sun came up. I didn't sleep, didn't even blink much. When it was light enough to see, I stepped out and checked the area. The mud told the story. There were tracks, heavy boot prints circling the cabin, clear impressions on the porch. One of them had stood less than 2 feet from the door for several minutes. There were even prints up the slope toward the trees. Both sets disappeared into the forest. I didn't pack. I just grabbed my bag, my gun, and my keys. I threw everything in the back of the Tahoe and peeled out. My tires skidded on the muddy trail as I flew down that gravel road. I didn't stop once, not even to piss. When I reached Lewiston, I pulled into a gas station and just sat in the lot, staring at my shaking hands on the wheel. I didn't call the cops. I didn't know what I'd tell them. 2 guys in the woods scared me. There was no harm done, no crime I could prove. But something about the way those men acted, the slow movements, the silence, the circling, felt wrong in a way I still can't explain. I never spoke to Jerry again, never even told him what happened. I figured if he knew who they were, he wouldn't care, and if he didn't, it'd just scare him. For the next year, I kept a gun near my bed at all times. I checked locks 3-4 times a night. I moved to Boise, took a new job, tried to push it out of my head. But even now, more than 10 years later, I still think about it when I wake up at night. Not the part where I saw them, the part where they knew I was inside and didn't care.